What did Donald Trump do today? April 8, 2025 recap. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt held a briefing and delivered one of the most combative and ideologically charged performances of the Trump administration's second term. The tone throughout was aggressive, often more akin to a campaign rally than a government briefing. Leavitt deployed inflammatory language, referring to deportees as foreign terrorist invaders, and praising the Supreme Court for delivering a smackdown to a rogue left-wing judge. This kind of rhetoric undermines the seriousness of White House communications and transforms the press briefing room into a theater of partisan spectacle. Leavitt frequently fell back on rehearsed slogans and buzzwords like Trump's speed, tailor-made trade deals, and economic golden age, offering more sound bites than substance. When pressed for details, she often defaulted to deflection or vague promises of forthcoming information. On multiple fronts, especially regarding foreign policy, immigration, and trade, the briefing exposed a lack of coherence in administration policy. Leavitt floated legally questionable proposals, including the deportation of U.S. citizens to El Salvador, and dodged questions about the constitutionality of deportations under the Alien Enemies Act, mischaracterizing the Supreme Court's opinion in the process. Trade policy was a particular area of contradiction. While claiming tariffs were non-negotiable, Leavitt boasted about ongoing negotiations with over 70 countries, confusing the administration's stance. She provided no meaningful framework for how these tailor-made deals would work or how they aligned with the sweeping 104% tariffs being imposed on China. Economic claims were just as unsubstantiated. She cited $5 trillion in foreign investment without offering sources or details. She claimed credit for job growth and reduced prices without clear attribution to policy. Her references to deregulation and energy production were couched in hyperbole, such as drill baby drill, and unsupported by data. Strategically, the administration used the briefing to reframe old criticisms of global trade by quoting past Democratic leaders like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, suggesting that President Trump was now fulfilling their warnings from decades past. This rhetorical move was clever but deeply misleading, conflating general concerns about trade imbalances with Trump's extreme and isolationist measures. The administration also made a point of elevating its preferred media platforms, introducing a nonpartisan news outlet called Notice, and casting traditional media as dishonest or adversarial, a hallmark of its broader effort to reshape public discourse around its own ecosystem. Overall, this briefing epitomized the Trump administration's turn toward performative governance, where transparency is promised but withheld, policy is announced with bravado but little clarity, and adversaries, foreign or domestic, are treated with contempt. Leavitt's role appears less about informing the public and more about reinforcing a political narrative. The administration's priority is clearly to rally its base, not to engage the broader public in good faith dialogue. The briefing was legally flimsy, strategically confused, and diplomatically reckless. Donald Trump signed an executive order titled, Protecting American Energy from State Overreach, which represents a sweeping and aggressive attempt to centralize control over U.S. energy policy by curtailing the ability of state governments to regulate environmental and climate-related issues. Although the order is framed in the language of federalism and energy dominance, its legal and rhetorical structure betrays a deep hostility toward the very principles of state sovereignty and localized governance that federalism is supposed to protect. The order positions states such as New York, Vermont, and California as ideological outliers imposing burdens on the rest of the country, particularly by targeting their climate policies and environmental lawsuits as unconstitutional, extortionate, or anti-American. In doing so, it not only exaggerates the effects of these policies but also employs deeply partisan language that ridicules climate science and undermines the legitimacy of state-level democratic action. Legally, the order is on shaky ground. It directs the Attorney General to identify and suppress any state or local law, regulation, or civil cause of action that could be construed as a burden on domestic energy production. This includes laws related to climate change, environmental justice, or carbon pricing mechanisms. However, the executive branch does not have the constitutional authority to unilaterally declare state laws unconstitutional or preempted. that is a role reserved for the courts. Moreover, the order's directive to stop the enforcement of such laws could be seen as an overreach of prosecutorial discretion, especially given that many of the targeted policies involve litigation brought by private parties or democratically passed legislation at the state level. This move could set a troubling precedent by enabling the federal executive to selectively nullify state laws based on ideological disagreement rather than legal merit. The rhetorical tone of the order is particularly notable for its inflammatory language. Phrases like climate change and environmental justice are placed in quotation marks, signaling skepticism or outright mockery. State governments are accused of extortion for seeking compensation from fossil fuel companies for decades of environmental damage, a standard legal practice in tort law. The order paints state energy regulations as radical, dangerous, and unconstitutional, feeding into a grievance-based narrative that vilifies progressive states and climate advocates. This is not merely a matter of tone. Such language carries real consequences. It seeks to delegitimize climate accountability efforts and chill ongoing legal actions aimed at holding polluters responsible for environmental harm. Regarding policy, the executive order is a blunt instrument of fossil fuel favoritism. While it briefly mentions hydropower, geothermal, and other alternatives, its clear intent is to shield oil, gas, and coal companies from both market competition and legal liability. It equates energy dominance with national security and economic freedom without acknowledging that long-term security requires diversification into renewables and reductions in carbon dependency. By portraying climate action as an elite conspiracy against working families, the order avoids engaging with the reality of climate change. Instead, it promotes a narrative in which energy policy is a zero-sum political weapon. Structurally, the executive order lacks clarity and enforceability. It doesn't establish new legal authority but encourages reinterpretation of existing law in a partisan direction. It ends with the standard disclaimer that it does not create any right or benefit enforceable in court, a quiet admission that much of the order is more symbolic than substantive. Nonetheless, its symbolic impact is powerful. It positions climate accountability as illegitimate, encourages the Department of Justice to intervene in state affairs, and signals to fossil fuel producers that they will face no meaningful resistance from the federal government under Trump's administration. This executive order is a politically charged attempt to dismantle state-led climate action, delegitimize environmental justice initiatives, and shield fossil fuel interests from public scrutiny and legal responsibility. While it may serve short-term partisan goals and excite Trump's base, it undermines legal norms, federalist principles, and the long-term viability of a sustainable national energy policy. Donald Trump held an executive order signing event on unleashing American energy that was less a coherent policy address and more a sprawling, improvisational performance packed with populist symbolism, personal anecdotes, and political grievances. Framed as a revival of the coal industry, the speech attempted to elevate coal to a near-mythic status, calling it beautiful clean coal throughout, while dismissing environmental concerns, regulatory safeguards, and climate science. The central message was clear. Under his administration, coal would be prioritized not just as an energy source but as a cultural and economic identity, one unfairly suppressed by Democrats and globalists. Trump positioned himself as a liberator of the coal industry from Biden's war on coal, invoking the Defense Production Act, lifting leasing moratoriums on federal lands, streamlining permits, and pledging to fight state-level environmental policies in court. He even promised to construct legal guarantees that would prevent future administrations from shutting coal plants down, an extreme and likely unconstitutional gesture that reflects his broader attempt to lock partisan economic policy into place through executive fiat. Rhetorically, the event followed the familiar Trump formula: lengthy off-script tangents, boasts about his past endorsements and zoning success, sarcastic jabs at Democrats, and unverified or misleading statistics. He often digressed, from praising allies in the room and recalling campaign stories to blaming California's water crisis on environmentalism and ridiculing the Paris Climate Accord. This meandering delivery diluted the gravity of the executive orders and distracted from what should have been a clear articulation of energy policy. Instead, the speech served primarily as a symbolic rebuke to climate-conscious governance, mocking woke energy policy and deriding the Green New Deal as a scam conceived by an uneducated congresswoman. Policy-wise, Trump's actions raise serious legal and constitutional concerns. Using the Defense Production Act to turbocharge coal production distorts the law's original purpose, ensuring national security in times of crisis, not subsidizing politically favored industries. Promising long-term legal protections against future regulation, essentially insulating coal from the democratic process, is an unprecedented power grab that could invite judicial challenges. Additionally, directing the Department of Justice to investigate state energy policies infringes on state sovereignty, a position at odds with traditional conservative values of federalism. The speech was also rife with factual distortions. Trump claimed that China is opening 2 coal plants a week, an outdated and oversimplified figure, while failing to mention the country's aggressive investment in renewables. He declared that coal is indestructible and environmentally superior without acknowledging its carbon intensity or global decline in economic competitiveness. Assertions about California's blackouts being solely due to wind and solar are misleading. The causes of grid instability are far more complex. He dismissed climate change as trivial, sarcastically citing rising oceans and invoking apocalyptic nuclear threats as the real issue instead. Politically, the event was less about serious energy planning and more about reinforcing Trump's alignment with rural working-class voters in coal-heavy states like West Virginia and Kentucky. By portraying coal miners as noble, misunderstood patriots and their critics as elitist and ignorant, Trump used energy policy as a wedge issue. It was a culture war speech masquerading as a policy initiative, laced with nostalgia, fueled by grievance, and designed to punish political enemies through regulatory reversals. This event reflects Trump's broader approach to governance: theatrical, impulsive, and centered around loyalty and symbolism rather than strategic planning or economic foresight. It may resonate emotionally with his base, but it offers little in the way of realistic solutions for a changing global energy landscape. Instead of charting a path forward, it clings to a past that is no longer economically or environmentally sustainable and does so at the expense of regulatory integrity, constitutional norms, and factual clarity. Donald Trump's executive order titled and quote, "Strengthening the Reliability and Security of the United States Electric Grid" end quote, is a sweeping directive that frames rising electricity demand, driven by AI data centers and domestic manufacturing, as a national security issue requiring emergency action. While the order accurately notes increasing strain on the grid, it uses that diagnosis to justify a return to centralized fossil fuel-heavy energy planning, prioritizing secure, redundant fuel supplies, a clear reference to coal, natural gas, and nuclear power. This emphasis effectively sidelines renewable energy and modern grid technologies like battery storage, which are not recognized in the order's framework for ensuring reliability. The most significant policy mechanism invoked is Section 202C of the Federal Power Act, which gives the Department of Energy emergency authority to compel the operation of power plants during grid emergencies. Trump's order seeks to normalize this rarely used provision, allowing the DOE to fast-track its use whenever temporary interruptions are forecasted, regardless of state-level regulation or environmental impact. Furthermore, the executive order instructs the DOE to develop a uniform methodology to assess grid reserve margins, which appears technical and neutral on the surface but is likely to disfavor intermittent renewable sources. It directs the department to accredit generation resources based on historical performance in real-time scenarios, a measure that could artificially lower the value of clean energy sources and boost fossil fuel reliability metrics. A particularly controversial section empowers the DOE to prevent any power plant over 50 megawatts from shutting down or switching fuel sources if doing so would reduce accredited capacity, as defined by the new methodology. This provision effectively locks aging and potentially polluting power plants into continued operation under the banner of reliability, even when they are no longer economically viable. The order sidesteps any mention of carbon emissions, climate change, or long-term environmental goals despite citing technological advancement as a key driver of new demand. While the language of national security and resilience is prominent throughout the order, it serves as a rhetorical vehicle for policies that reinforce legacy energy infrastructure and override environmental standards. The directive centralizes authority in the federal executive branch, marginalizes state control, and could distort electricity markets by forcing utilities to maintain generation assets that might otherwise be phased out. It is consistent with the Trump administration's broader deregulatory approach, prioritizing short-term grid capacity and fossil fuel use over innovation, sustainability, and climate resilience. The result is a politically charged, environmentally regressive order that reflects an outdated view of the energy landscape cloaked in emergency justification. Donald Trump signed another in a series of executive orders. This one, titled Regulatory Relief for Certain Stationary Sources to Promote American Energy, marks a significant environmental rollback aimed at delaying the enforcement of stricter pollution standards on coal-fired power plants. Framed as a matter of national security and economic necessity, the order grants a 2-year exemption from compliance with the EPA's updated Mercury and Air Toxic Standards, MATS, which were finalized under the Biden administration in May 2024 and set to take effect in 2027. Trump asserts that the updated rule imposes unattainable burdens on the coal industry by requiring emissions control technologies that are not commercially viable. He further claims that these requirements threaten jobs, grid reliability, and national security by endangering the continued operation of coal plants. However, this rationale is deeply flawed on legal, environmental, and technical grounds. Legally, the Clean Air Act allows for limited and specific compliance extensions through the EPA, not through a blanket presidential exemption, making Trump's move vulnerable to legal challenges on the basis of executive overreach. Scientifically, the claim that technology to meet the revised MATS does not exist is misleading. The EPA's updated rule was based on data from existing facilities that have already implemented improved controls. The administration appears to conflate economic resistance from industry stakeholders with genuine technological infeasibility. This distinction is critical as public health protections hinge on science-based regulatory enforcement, not on industry convenience. Moreover, the order relies on an outdated narrative of coal's strategic value. In reality, coal's role in the U.S. energy grid has diminished significantly, with renewable energy and natural gas now providing more electricity at lower costs. Framing coal as essential to national security ignores broader energy transition trends and downplays the risks associated with continued fossil fuel dependence, including climate vulnerability and long-term grid inflexibility. By delaying the implementation of toxic emissions controls, the executive order undermines public health, especially in communities near coal plants, and signals a retreat from innovation in the energy sector. This action is less about grid security and more about ideological loyalty to the coal industry. It fits into the broader pattern of the Trump administration's second-term approach, dismantling environmental protections under the guise of economic populism while disregarding science, legal precedent, and the long-term public interest. President Trump's executive order reinvigorating America's beautiful clean coal industry is a sweeping attempt to revive the coal industry through deregulation, reclassification, and federal support. Framed in nationalist and nostalgic language, the order positions coal as essential to national security, economic growth, and even the energy demands of AI infrastructure. It directs federal agencies to roll back environmental regulations, fast-track coal leasing on public lands, and eliminate internal policies that disfavor coal, essentially mandating institutional alignment with fossil fuel interests. The order also attempts to redefine coal as a critical mineral, opening the door to additional subsidies and strategic prioritization. However, these policies rest on outdated assumptions, ignoring that coal is being replaced by cheaper, cleaner alternatives like wind, solar, and natural gas. The suggestion that AI data centers will be powered by coal contradicts current industry trends, as major tech firms increasingly rely on renewable energy. By undermining environmental oversight and promoting a fuel in global decline, the order isolates the U.S. from international climate efforts and risks legal challenges. Ultimately, it reflects a political agenda rather than a forward-looking energy strategy, favoring a nostalgic vision of coal over economic and environmental realities. Donald Trump's recent Truth Social post reads more like a campaign infomercial than a serious diplomatic update. He opens with a boast about a great call with the acting president of South Korea, quickly pivoting into a list of loosely connected topics: trade surplus, tariffs, LNG purchases, and Alaska pipeline and military payments, without offering specifics or context. The mention of South Korea's tremendous and unsustainable surplus reflects his long-standing obsession with trade imbalances, yet ignores the complexities of global trade economics. His claim that South Korea paid billions during his first term for U.S. military protection, only for Joe Biden to allegedly terminate the deal, is a distortion. Biden's administration actually negotiated increased cost-sharing, not a rollback. Trump's tone remains promotional throughout, using phrases like big-time military protection and one-stop shopping, with his characteristic overuse of capitalization and exclamation marks, more suited to a rally speech than international relations. Beyond South Korea, Trump casually asserts that China also wants to make a deal badly, but offers no details, only the vague assurance that we are waiting for their call. This is less a substantive foreign policy statement and more a projection of his own brand as the ultimate dealmaker. He frames complex geopolitical relationships as if they're simple business transactions he alone can manage. By emphasizing his personal role and minimizing institutional processes, he continues to portray diplomacy as a one-man show. The result is a disjointed and self-congratulatory message that undermines serious diplomacy, misrepresents prior agreements, and once again reduces international negotiations to a spectacle of personal triumph. Source: Truth Social. The Supreme Court temporarily blocked a lower court order that required the Trump administration to reinstate 16,000 recently fired federal employees. These workers, all on probationary status, were dismissed as part of the administration's effort to downsize the federal government. A judge had found the firings potentially unlawful, prompting a legal challenge. This is the third time in a week the Supreme Court has sided with Trump's administration, curbing federal judges' efforts to stall parts of his agenda. However, the ruling is narrow, focusing on the legal standing of the nonprofits involved in the lawsuit. Despite the block, many employees remain on paid administrative leave due to a separate lawsuit affecting a broader group of agencies and states in Maryland. That case, along with appeals from the Justice Department, continues. Critics, including unions and public service groups, argue the mass firings were illegal and politically motivated, undermining essential government programs. Judge Alsup, who issued the original reinstatement order, said the firings were based on flimsy claims of poor performance despite positive evaluations and violated federal protocols. The legal fight over the scope and legality of the terminations is ongoing. Source: Associated Press. According to a Monday memo from Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, the Trump administration has disbanded the Department of Justice's National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, NCT. The move is part of a broader effort to remove regulatory oversight from the digital finance sector. It aligns with a January executive order aimed at establishing well-defined jurisdictional regulatory boundaries to promote U.S. leadership in the cryptocurrency space. The memo states that the Criminal Division's Computer Crime and Intellectual Property Section (CIPS) will now provide guidance to DOJ officials and collaborate with the crypto industry. At the same time, the Market Integrity and Major Frauds Unit will shift its focus away from cryptocurrency enforcement to instead concentrate on immigration and procurement fraud. The DOJ will no longer pursue litigation or enforcement actions that effectively impose regulatory frameworks on digital assets, opting instead to leave that responsibility to federal regulatory agencies operating outside the criminal justice system. However, the department clarified that it will continue to prosecute individuals who use digital assets in connection with crimes such as terrorism, narcotics trafficking, organized crime, hacking and gang financing, or those who exploit crypto investors. The policy change reflects the Trump administration's broader deregulatory agenda and increasing embrace of the crypto sector. Since returning to office, President Trump has prioritized government withdrawal from crypto regulation, established a federal Bitcoin reserve, and hosted a crypto summit at the White House. These actions have drawn sharp criticism from Democrats, who argue that Trump's personal investments in cryptocurrency pose a serious conflict of interest. Representative Jerry Connolly, the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, accused the administration of creating a strategic cryptocurrency reserve that could enrich the president and his allies at taxpayers' expense. His March letter to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent followed Republican senators' own concerns about the Securities and Exchange Commission's handling of a case involving the cryptocurrency firm DebtBox, which allegedly defrauded investors of $49 million. While the administration frames the dissolution of NCT as a necessary step toward innovation and regulatory clarity, critics argue that it strips away essential investor protections at a time when the crypto space remains vulnerable to fraud and abuse. By removing the DOJ's specialized crypto enforcement unit and diminishing its regulatory enforcement role, the Trump administration risks enabling unchecked growth in a sector where it has direct financial interests. Source: The Hill. The U.S. Supreme Court temporarily halted a lower court's order requiring the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, a Maryland legal resident wrongfully deported to a high-security prison in El Salvador by the Trump administration on March 15. A 2019 court order had protected Abrego Garcia from deportation, but he was removed due to what the government called an administrative error. U.S. District Judge Paula Zines deemed the deportation unlawful and ordered his return by midnight Monday. The Fourth Circuit denied the government's request to pause her ruling, but the Supreme Court issued an administrative stay Monday afternoon, giving Abrego Garcia's legal team until Tuesday to respond. The Trump administration called the lower court's deadline arbitrary and unprecedented, arguing that it forced rushed foreign negotiations and raised national security concerns. U.S. Solicitor General John Sauer said the court lacks authority over El Salvador, and the White House labeled the ruling an erroneous case of judicial overreach. Abrego Garcia's attorney countered that the government is avoiding accountability and emphasized that his client has no criminal record and fled gang violence in 2011. Judge Zines condemned the deportation as wholly lawless, citing abusive detention conditions in El Salvador and the failure to follow proper legal procedures. His family remains hopeful and continues to advocate for his safe return. Source: NBC News. U.S. District Judge Trevor McFadden, a Trump appointee, issued a ruling mandating the reinstatement of the Associated Press (AP) to the White House press pool. The decision follows the Trump administration's removal of the AP from access privileges after the wire service refused to adopt President Donald Trump's unilateral rebranding of the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. Judge McFadden's ruling emphasizes that the First Amendment prohibits the federal government from discriminating against journalists based on their viewpoints. He wrote that if the White House opens access to certain journalists, for example in the Oval Office, the East Room, or aboard Air Force One, it must apply the same access standards to all credentialed press, regardless of their editorial positions. McFadden sharply criticized the administration's conduct as brazen, and noted that viewpoint discrimination is unconstitutional even in highly restricted or curated spaces within the White House, except under specific conditions like formal, prearranged interviews. The judge clarified that ad hoc press events, briefings, or opportunities to witness official proceedings cannot be restricted based on editorial disagreements or refusal to adopt government-imposed terminology. The ruling compels the White House to restore the AP's credentials and grant equal access to any spaces or events where other members of the press pool are admitted. This decision reaffirms existing legal precedents protecting journalistic freedom and reinforces the principle that government access cannot be conditioned on ideological conformity or political loyalty. Source: Politico. The U.S. State Department announced it has reversed some funding cuts to the UN World Food Programme, WFP, emergency projects in 14 impoverished countries, admitting that certain life-saving aid contracts were terminated in error. Spokeswoman Tammy Bruce did not specify which countries had aid restored or how the error occurred. The rollback follows an AP report revealing that the Trump administration had cut WFP emergency funding in countries like Afghanistan, Syria, and Yemen, among others, despite prior assurances from Secretary of State Marco Rubio that such humanitarian aid would be protected, even as the U.S. Agency for International Development (USAID) was being dismantled. Most USAID programs have been canceled, with the remaining few, including WFP support, targeted in recent terminations. These were ordered by Jeremy Lewin, an official in Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, overseeing the shutdown of USAID operations. The WFP, which helps prevent starvation for millions, publicly urged the U.S. to reconsider, warning that the cuts could be a death sentence for those in crisis zones. Source: Associated Press.